All right, it is a new semester, a new year, and we have a new unit as well. Okay, so this semester we're going to be covering the year 1900 through the present day. And this first unit here, Unit 7, is going to cover the early 20th century. So the years 1900 to 1939, right up until the beginning of World War II. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is basically the first decade and a half of the 20th century, um, what we call the Progressive Era, that's around 1900 to 1914. So the turn of the 20th century here, the turn of the 1900s, this was a time of a lot of progress, a lot of change in the United States and throughout a lot of the world as well. There were four presidents during the Progressive Era. One we've already talked about, William McKinley. He was the last president we talked about last unit. Remember, he was president during the Spanish-American War, and he also was assassinated. Now, when he was assassinated, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, took office. His face is actually on Mount Rushmore. He was seen as a very good president, very effective, and he is kind of the hallmark president of the Progressive Era. So we're going to be talking a lot about him today. After him came William Howard Taft, okay, the guy on the bottom left, followed by Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during World War I. Now, there are a lot of really huge human achievements that took place during the Progressive Era. The first of which that we're going to talk about is the first flight. Okay, you probably heard the story of the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright. They made the first ever successful airplane flight. There were these two brothers from Ohio. They owned a bicycle shop, and they said, you know what, we can make an airplane. We really want to be the first in flight. So after many years of experimentation and trying, they were finally able to get off the ground. It was on a beach in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and the first airplane flight happened, and that was December 17th, 1903. So the United States was first in flight because of the Wright brothers. Now, the airplane was used by the U.S. in World War I, and that's one of the big reasons why our side won that war. And then, of course, by the 1920s, you have airplanes being used for passenger and postal service. You have people now traveling commercially across the country, and that, of course, led to the airline industry that we have today. So huge human accomplishment. Ever since really the beginning, really for thousands of years, humans have wanted to fly, have wanted to see the world from up above. And finally, because of the Wright brothers, we were able to do that. Another big human accomplishment that was pretty remarkable in 1909, a guy named Edwin Peary discovered the North Pole. Now, we always knew that there was a North Pole. You know, we knew the Earth was round, and that if you went far enough north, you'd be kind of at the top of the world, so to speak. But no one had ever been there. No one had ever been able to find exactly where the North Pole was, or even be able to survive in the extremely cold and windy conditions. But Edwin Peary was able to do that, do what no one ever had done before. And his expedition, keep in mind, did not even have any modern day equipment. He didn't have oxygen tanks to help him breathe in the very, very thin and cold air. He did not have insulation to keep him warm. He didn't have GPS like we would need today. He basically had the stars. He had a map that he wasn't sure was completely correct, and he had a compass. And he was able to make it to the North Pole. So huge accomplishment, first person to ever do that. Now, one very tragic event that took place during the Progressive Era was the sinking of the Titanic. You probably heard about that. A lot of us have probably seen the movie Titanic that was based off of this event. And this took place in April of 1912. So this Titanic was a technological innovation. It was an absolute marvel. People around the world were keeping up with the construction of this ship and how massive it was, one of the biggest ships in the world, and it was said to be completely unsinkable. The people who made it, the engineers, said this is the first ever unsinkable ship. Nothing could possibly sink this ship. And it was on its maiden voyage from Europe to America when it hit an iceberg. Now you have thousands of people, thousands of passengers on board, and the hull of the ship scraped against the side of an iceberg, and water just started to pour into the ship. So it took about 2 hours, but the ship did sink. About 1,500 people died when it hit an iceberg and sank. Some of them drowned, some of them froze in the icy cold water. Just a tragic event that occurred, and really no one saw it coming. It was all over the newspaper, and people said, "What in the world? That this ship was supposed to be unsinkable." But of course, it wasn't. So even with the Progressive Era, you have a lot of new technological innovations, and you have a lot of new human accomplishments, like for instance, building a ship this massive. But you also see that progress comes at a price, and sometimes people die in an attempt to forge ahead. So the United States during the Progressive Era was very much imperialistic. They got very involved in imperialism during the Progressive Era. We've talked about imperialism. We know what that is. We know the pros and cons of it. We know why countries imperialize. And in the Progressive Era, the United States got involved in imperialism for 5 reasons specifically. One was to spread American culture, values, and religion. If you love your country, if you are proud of your country's culture, values, if you have a strong faith, you're going to want to spread that to other people. And that was one big reason that the United States looked to gain colonies outside of our own borders. Also to increase trade, to stimulate the economy, to become a world power, to gain access to raw materials and natural resources that maybe didn't grow or weren't found naturally in abundance in America, and also to build military bases around the world for protection. And we did. A lot of our bases were in the Pacific, still are, and they were even used later on in World War II. So there are a lot of positive and negative results of imperialism in general, and American imperialism was no exception. Okay, you have some positive results like stimulating economic development and modernization in previously impoverished countries in Latin America and in the Pacific. You have the United States bringing in a lot of new industry to these countries. Also, the United States was able to acquire natural resources and spread the concept of democracy all around the world. However, like I said, all progress or all change really comes at a price, and there are always setbacks, always negatives to it. And that's because a lot of countries were imperialized by force. They were forced into colonization, and a lot of times their cultural heritage was destroyed. Sometimes imperialism can lead to oppression. Not always, but if it's done incorrectly and immorally, it certainly can. And sometimes, even with American imperialism, that did happen. Now we're going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt. This guy was an absolute character. If you just look at him, the big smile he had, huge personality, he was an absolute character. All right, so he was from New York. He was born into a very wealthy family, had a super charismatic, positive, and kind of magnetic personality. If you were at a party, at a get-together, he was the one you wanted to talk to. He'd always have a bunch of people around him. He'd be telling a story, laughing and laughing. And that's just the kind of person he was, the kind of person you're just drawn to and want to be friends with. He also loved the outdoors. He was a big outdoorsman, always wanted to be outside. He was really into exercising. He loved to hunt, loved to fish, especially boxing. He was a big boxer. In fact, there was one time he was temporarily blinded in one of his eyes while he was president because he insisted on fighting one of the best boxers in the country, and that boxer temporarily blinded him in one eye. You might think, how irresponsible. You're the president of the United States. You need both eyes. But that's how important it was to Theodore Roosevelt to, get his exercise and compete with the young people. He also was a huge supporter of imperialism. He thought that was a good thing. It would increase our international dominance. So Roosevelt was a colonel during the Spanish-American War. When McKinley was president, he was a colonel. He and his group of Rough Riders, they were called, they fought on horseback. And when you fight on horseback, that's called cavalry. Now, he became famous with his success at the Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. A lot of generals will give orders to their troops and say, hey, go charge up that hill. Teddy Roosevelt said, hey, follow me up that hill. I'll lead you up that hill. So he was a special kind of guy and definitely brave. Now, he became the president of the United States when President McKinley died. So McKinley had already been president for a full term, and Teddy Roosevelt was not his vice president for the first term. But going into his second term, McKinley chose TR as his vice president in 1900. So McKinley won a second term, but just a few months into his second term in 1901, he was assassinated, and this made TR president at the age of 42. Now, I know most of y'all are teenagers, and that doesn't sound young at all, but that is the youngest any president has ever been. We have never had a younger president than Theodore Roosevelt, the youngest president in all of U.S. history, at the age of 42. Usually presidents are much older, at least 50s, 60s, sometimes in the cases of people like Trump and Reagan, 70s. Sometimes it's even as old as in your 70s. But Teddy Roosevelt was 42 when he became president, youngest president in U.S. history. He also became a very popular and a very active leader. Teddy Roosevelt had four major goals. There were really four major goals of progressives like Teddy Roosevelt, that's what he called himself, during the time of what we call the Progressive Era. One of the goals of progressives was to end government corruption. They saw a lot of corruption within the government during the Gilded Age, and they said we need to fix that. They said we also need to limit the power of big businesses and break up monopolies and trusts, which were basically collective monopolies. They said we also need to improve working conditions, usually through the work of labor unions, and to improve the health and safety of all people, usually through government regulation. So in these ways, they really hoped to kind of correct the abuses that had been brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Roosevelt's domestic policy was called the Square Deal. The Square Deal, because he kind of wanted to be fair and square for people. And there were three components of this policy, all of which start with a C. So that's how you can remember it. All three components of the Square Deal start with a C. Okay, the first component of Teddy Roosevelt's domestic policy was control of corporations. He said we need to limit big businesses by breaking up trusts and monopolies. Yes, we need to have a free market, but he said we can't be laissez-faire anymore. We can't be completely hands-off because that leads to monopolies, that leads to unfair prices, that leads to bad working conditions and unfair wages and child labor and unsafe working conditions. And he said, therefore, we need to have some control over the corporations as the government. The second component of the Square Deal was consumer protection. He said we need to make sure prices are fair and products are advertised honestly. We need to make sure products are labeled accurately and make sure prices aren't too high. And the third component of his domestic policy was conservation. He was a big believer in conservation and protecting the environment. He did this by creating national parks. He created 5 national parks during his time in office. He also created the Department of the Interior, which oversees the maintenance and upkeep of national parks. The Department of the Interior is actually the department that created Natchez Trace Parkway that some of us drive on sometimes. And he also withdrew 150 million acres of land from public sale to create places like wildlife reserves and just to conserve as much of the environment as he could without damaging the economy and making people lose their jobs. Now, there were 2 laws specifically that Teddy Roosevelt helped create in 1906 in order to protect consumers. The first one was the Meat Inspection Act, and this required the government to inspect all slaughterhouses, all meat packing factories, anywhere where food was being produced on a large scale, especially meat, and the government would check for sanitary conditions, make sure that you're not making people's food in a filthy factory to where they're going to get sick with whatever goes into their food. And the reason why he signed this was because he read a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And in this book, Upton Sinclair talks about all these nasty sausage factories that he went into and meat factories and slaughterhouses that just had filthy conditions. There were rats on the floor, and sometimes the owners of the factories would put out poisoned bread for the rats, so the rats would die. And then sometimes the rats and the poisoned bread and the meat would all go into the hopper together, and then they would all be ground into sausage. So you'd have like dead rats in your sausage, you'd have bugs everywhere. And when Teddy Roosevelt read this, he said he considered becoming a vegetarian because he was so disgusted with it. So he signed the Meat Inspection Act to try to make that not happen anymore. He also signed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was equally important, and this made sure that all foods were clean and inspected to make sure that all food and medicine were properly labeled. He said we need to make sure that companies are labeling their food honestly so that people know what they're putting into their bodies. Another tragedy that took place during the Progressive Era, in addition to the Titanic sinking, was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. A fire broke out on the fifth floor of this factory in New York City in 1911, and there were no government safety regulations for businesses at this time. Therefore, there was no way to escape and no way for the fire to get out. Now, if you think what would happen if a fire broke out in Mr. Kettler's classroom, okay, we have several options. Okay, first of all, if you look at the ceiling, there are sprinklers. All right, then you also have fire alarms, and we also have doors and windows that we can get out of, and no floor is too high for us to get out. Now, at this time, there were no safety regulations like that. Basically, you had a bucket of water on each story, and that was it. So when the fire broke out, they dumped the bucket of water on it, but that wasn't enough, and it kept spreading. The fire kept spreading all across the floor. So you had people rush to the elevator, and the elevator wouldn't work. And then they rushed to the stairs, and the stairway was blocked because they would lock the door so that the workers couldn't leave to go on an early lunch or be dishonest about their time cards and stuff. And so they go to the window and cry for help, and the fire department comes, and they try to get their ladder up there, but their ladder doesn't reach to that floor. It doesn't reach to the fifth floor. So you have a lot of people dying in a very short period of time. Within 30 minutes, 146 workers died in the flames. Some of them burned. A lot of them just jumped and died in that way. And after this, because so many people died needlessly, and if there actually were safety regulations and fire exits and things like that, then these people wouldn't have died. This really encouraged the federal government to pass a lot of reforms to improve safety in the workplace, which is why we have those safety standards today. Roosevelt's foreign policy was called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Y'all know what the Monroe Doctrine is. We've talked about it before. And remember, the Monroe Doctrine said that Europe needs to stay in their hemisphere. We will stay in our hemisphere. Now, TR really enforced the Monroe Doctrine by declaring that no foreign nation has the right any longer to interfere in government and economic affairs in Latin America except for the U.S. So not only now could European countries actually own countries in the Caribbean and in Latin America, not only were they forbidden from doing that, but Teddy Roosevelt said now Europe is not even allowed to interfere even in the economies of Latin America. He said, this is our hemisphere. We're going to be the policemen of the Western Hemisphere. And TR had a philosophy. He summed it up in one phrase. He said, speak softly and carry a big stick. And that's what he said. He'd carry a big club, make sure people know that you have the ability to hurt them. You have the ability to wage war with them and win, but still speak softly and let them know that you don't want to do that, but just that you can if they insist upon it. Roosevelt's greatest foreign policy achievement was the building of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is huge. It's still used today. You have hundreds of ships going through the Panama Canal every week. It's very important to trade even still today in the 21st century. TR protected Panama's independence by threatening to attack Colombia. He said, Colombia, if you invade Panama, then we are going to attack you. He's kind of speaking softly, carrying a big stick kind of thing. And in doing this, TR secured the U.S. access to the country of Panama and influence in that country, and gained us the right to build the Panama Canal. So if you look at this picture here of Panama, right here is America. You got the coast of Mississippi up here, and then down here you have Panama in Central America. So if you look at the Panama Canal, it cuts right through the country of Panama right there. Here's a picture of the canal, all right, just very impressive. Another really huge human accomplishment to build this canal. And it was really important because before this canal was built, you had to travel all the way around the tip of South America to get from one side of the Americas to the next. But now you can actually go through the Panama Canal and not have to travel nearly as much. And this was really good for trade, and it increased America's prestige because we owned the canal. Okay, so a water route in Central America was absolutely necessary. It was necessary in order to save time and money on trade and transportation in the Western Hemisphere. Some people just weren't trading in the Western Hemisphere or on the west coast of the Americas because it took so long to sail around the Straits of Tierra del Fuego on the tip of South America. Okay, so building this canal right here made it a lot more efficient in order to sail. The Panama Canal was built with shovels and dynamite. That's basically the height of technology that they had, was shovels and dynamite. It took 10 years to build, from 1904 to 1914, and it gave the U.S. a huge amount of influence in Latin America, and it really improved trade worldwide. It was good for everybody. Now, the U.S. interacted with Asia quite a bit during the Progressive Era. We saw Asia, similar to the U.S., as an up-and-coming region in the world, a place of increased influence that Europe was kind of declining. America and Asia was kind of on the rise. And in 1900, the people of China rebelled against foreign influences in their country, including the U.S. They said, we don't want Western influences. We want our own culture. We want our own economy. We're going to be isolated once again. And this became known as the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion, whenever they tried to expel foreign nations from China. They failed to do this. The Chinese failed to do this, and the United States remained a major trading partner with China and other Asian countries throughout the Progressive Era and throughout a good chunk of the 20th century. All right, so the Boxer Rebellion was a failure, and China was not able to isolate themselves the way they wanted to just yet. Also, in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt helped to bring an end to the Russo-Japanese War. This was between the Empire of Russia and the emerging Empire of Japan. Remember, both Japan and Russia are quickly modernizing at this time. They were both late to the game of the Industrial Revolution, and they're both making up for lost time. And they were fighting a war in 1906, which Teddy Roosevelt helped to end. And for this, he was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. After Teddy Roosevelt came President Taft, President William Howard Taft. One of the most famous things he is known for is being the heaviest president. He was 305 pounds. He was not able to tie his own shoes because of his big belly. And one time he actually got stuck in the White House bathtub and had a lot of trouble getting out. People had to come in and help him. So for that reason, that's one big reason why Taft is famous. But for our purposes, the big thing we need to know about Taft is dollar diplomacy. Okay, that was Taft's foreign policy. It was similar to Teddy Roosevelt's, but it was a little bit different. This said that the U.S. should influence countries in Latin America by investing financially in their countries. He said, this is the best way of intervention. This is the best way to imperialize, is to not necessarily make colonies, but to invest in other countries. And by financing businesses and industries in Latin American countries and lending them money, Taft said that the U.S. was going to gain allies and gain economic control of this region. And that's exactly what happened. Okay, whenever you give someone a gift, they kind of owe you one, right? And that is how Taft viewed Latin America, and it worked very well for the U.S. And it worked well for Latin America, too, because they got to industrialize. So it was really good for both sides here, very successful foreign policy, very effective. And it really globalized industrialization. It made the Industrial Revolution global instead of just something that occurred in the West and in Japan. It started to pick up steam all around the world. Okay, one of the last things here, there were 4 progressive amendments, 4 different amendments to the Constitution that were legalized during the Progressive Era. The first one was income tax. That's the 16th Amendment. Some would say one of the worst ones. Before the 16th Amendment, income tax was only something that was implemented during wartime, and then you would stop being taxed on your income. You would just be taxed on things that you buy, sales tax. And in the Progressive Era, Congress and the president said, you know what, we need a continuous flow of money into the government, a larger flow, so we need to start taxing people's income, and that is when the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, was established. Okay, so the 16th Amendment established permanent income tax, meaning we're going to be taxed on our income not just during wartime, but all the time. 17th Amendment, this one's kind of minor. This led to the direct election of senators, meaning that senators are not just going to be elected by elites, not just by other members of the government, but the people themselves are going to directly elect senators. The 18th Amendment was the prohibition of alcohol. There was a big problem at this time, and that was the fact that about half of all violent crimes were done by people who were under the influence of alcohol. So people said, hey, you know what, let's just illegalize alcohol and we'll cut the crime rate in half. Unfortunately, it didn't work that way because people found ways to make it themselves and get it illegally, and it actually ended up increasing crime. So that amendment was later on repealed. And then the 17th Amendment was women's suffrage. In 1920, women got the right to vote for the first time in U.S. history. Okay, here's a famous quote from Teddy Roosevelt. He said, "A vote is like a rifle. Its usefulness depends upon the character of the user." And going back a little bit further, Abraham Lincoln said the ballot is stronger than the bullet. Okay, so a lot of reasons for increasing the right to vote. Last thing here, the Chinese Revolution of 1911. So 1911, the Chinese people rebelled and overturned the Qing dynasty. Remember when we talked about ancient China earlier this year? We talked about the dynasties, and the Qing dynasty was the very last one. The Chinese people rebelled, overturned this dynasty, and China then became a republic. They wanted a modern government, did not want a monarchy anymore, did not want the dynastic system, did not want emperors, and so they rebelled and created a republic. Now, this new modern government of China was very weak. It did not latch on very well. It became corrupt very quickly, and it was really controlled by a lot of other nations as well. So it was not a very effective government. Remember how I always say, whenever you overturn a government, what do you have to have? You have to have something better to replace it with. Otherwise, your revolution is not going to work. So the weakness of the Chinese Republic actually led to a second Chinese Revolution in 1949, and this one was much worse. This one was led by Mao Zedong, and this revolution is what made China communist, which it still is today. We'll be talking more about communist China later on in this semester, but just to know for this unit here, 1911, that was the first Chinese Revolution. All right, well, that is the Progressive Era. Let me know if you have any questions or if I can explain anything more clearly for you.